Què tal? Benvinguts, benvingudes una nit més aquí al meu canal de Twitch. Estem en directe, són les 10:02, si no falla el rellotge d'aquí, del meu ordinador. Això ho faig des de l'ordinador, no és màgia. O sigui, no tinc un pou, tiro uns polvos, surt una boira i començo a fer directe, no. Utilitzo un ordinador, un portàtil concretament, un MSI. Van bé, són de gaming, són bons, d'acord? Què tal? Bé, tot bé. Som al dia 18 del 2 de 2022, això vol dir que és divendres tot el dia, des que comença fins que acaba, serà divendres. I què passa els divendres? Doncs que fem terrors nocturns, hombre jogo. Què tal? Espero que estiguis molt bé. Total, que això, que avui és terrors nocturns i parlarem d'un tema que està força bé, com és H.P. Lovecraft. Avui el que faré serà emetre un documental i el anirem comentant així la seva vida i obra i tot això. El documental és molt xulo. És potser els millors documentals que s'ha fet mai de Lovecraft. És molt complet, està molt bé, els convidats que hi porten són molt interessants i jo crec que us molarà bastant. També us dic una cosa. Això ho vaig planejar a principi de setmana i després m'he recordat que avui s'estrenava la nova de la Matança de Texas, no? La nova entrega que l'han estrenat a Netflix. No hi aneu, ja la podeu veure demà, no m'abandonis. Però m'hauria molat fer potser això, un especial dedicat a repassar la saga de la Matança de Texas, ja que en soc bastant seguidor. Però bueno, serà un altre dia, ja tenia programat això i tampoc era qüestió de canviar-ho tot. Tot em ve de nou perquè no conec res de Lovecraft. Avui ho sabràs absolutament tot. Però tot. Ja veuràs perquè, la veritat, el documental està molt bé. He mirat crítiques i diuen que és dels millors documentals que hem fet mai sobre l'autor, o sigui que valdrà la pena. Abans de seguir, deixeu-me fer un comentari. Estava aquí preparant coses i tal i em diu la meva dona, vine. Vaig cap al menjador i li ha passat una foto als seus pares, o sigui, els pares de la meva dona, per WhatsApp, dient que jo sortia per la tele ara mateix. Sí, fa una estona estava sortint per Empordà Televisió. Hi ha un programa que es diu Què ha passat, d'àmbit comarcal, on te repassen tota l'actualitat de la setmana. I resulta que sortia jo per l'entrevista que vaig fer aquest dimecres al vicealcalde de Figueres, en Pere Caselles, i estaven comentant tot això i tal. M'han deixat superbé, He sortit amb el pit molt inflat de tot plegat, però m'ha sorprès molt que apareixies per la tele. I res, m'agrada comentar-ho perquè, ja us dic, m'han deixat superbé i tal, i estic molt content, la veritat, les xifres van ser molt i molt bones. Els comentaris que he rebut de la gent del voltant de la xerrada que vaig tenir amb en Pere superbones, sí que molt content. I és això, s'ha de fer contingut en català. Faig entreteniment normalment, però també m'agrada parlar una mica de política o de coses que m'interessen. I vaig demostrar l'altre dimecres que realment a la gent li interessa, o sigui que estic super content. Bona nit, Cabirol. I ja està, això, que estic molt content, gràcies a Empordà Televisió. Intentaré retallar el clip i penjar-ho a les meves xarxes perquè tothom qui vulgui pugui veure'l de nou, perquè, no sé, si us fa gràcia xafradejar, que pugueu veure què han parlat de mi i tot això. Dit això, recordeu que, sisplau, marqueu aquí sota el cor per començar-me a seguir i això us permetrà gratuïtament estar al tanto de sempre que faci un directe, poder xatejar per aquí i de més. I per altra banda, també hi ha una estrella per aquí sota. Si marques l'estrella, què t'ofereix? Doncs el que t'ofereix és subscriu-te al meu canal. Si tens Amazon Prime és completament gratuït i no tindràs publicitat, tindràs emoticones amb la meva cara i a més, quan feu un watch party d'Amazon Prime podràs veure la pel·lícula a l'hora que la veig jo i comentar-la tots plegats, d'acord? Això ja sabeu com va. Doncs no m'allargo gaire més perquè el documental és 1 hora i pico, o sigui que és llarguet, però com que val bastant la pena, doncs tirarem endavant. Espera, sí. Espera, ho acabo de centrar una mica, així ho veureu millor. Vale, esteu preparats, amics, amigues? Sí? A veure, ja està, ja ho tenim aquí. Tenim l'àudio a tope i li fotem el documental sobre la mítica figura de l'autor H.P. Lovecraft. I em direu com se sent el so, d'acord? Anem-hi. Bueno, per qui no ho sàpiga, H.P. Lovecraft és un autor, un dels més reconeguts dins el camp del terror.
The course of H.P. Lovecraft's life was altered by an unfortunate madness. In April of 1893, his father, a commercial traveler from the vicinity of Boston, was on business in Chicago.
I Lovecraft és l'autor que va crear lo del terror còsmic. Se sent de conya, fantàstic, gràcies per dir-ho.
Winfield's violent hallucinations would soon place him in Butler Hospital. His troubled wife, Susan Phillips Lovecraft, was forced to return home to her family in Providence, Rhode Island. With Susie was her 2-year-old son, Howard Phillips Lovecraft. Today, the man readers of weird fiction know as H.P. Lovecraft is ranked alongside America's best writers.
Que això també ho comentarem, Neil Gaiman, comencem forts.
And as we chug on into the 21st century, it doesn't seem to be going away.
He let drop away all the trappings of
Peter
what
Straub,
is
que és
called
amic de
horror,
Stephen
and he
King.
moved into some narrative peculiar to himself. He invented his own genre, really.
Lovecraft
Guillermo del Toro.
about the scale of man in the cosmos. So he is really the most articulate about saying there is an indifference from the ancient gods to man. Lovecraft takes that and ups the ante.
Recordem que Guillermo del Toro, Ramsey Campbell, un altre mític, Lo sin nombre i de més. Guillermo del Toro, com deia, sempre ha volgut adaptar H.P. Lovecraft a la gran pantalla. A les muntanyes de la Fuji és la seva obra que sempre ha volgut adaptar.
Cthulhu.
Cthulhu.
Azathoth. Yog-Sothoth.
És que els noms caga-t'hi,
These are the unspeakable names of the Old Ones, the very heart of Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos, a loosely connected canon which has gone on to become one of literature's most influential creations.
I don't know that Lovecraft ever sat down initially and went, I'm going to grow a grand mythos.
No, va anar construint a poc a poc.
It begins and then everything else sort of fits in.
It's a very complex sort of inbreeding of mythologies.
Té un univers propi molt extens. Es podria comparar perfectament amb el del Senyor dels Anells.
Things much older than Earth are gazing upon us with indifference and cruelty.
Those old ones were gone now, hidden in distant wastes and dark places all over the world, until the time when the great priest Cthulhu, from his dark house in the mighty city of R'lyeh under the waters, should rise and bring the earth again beneath his sway.
So instead of it being that there are,
Stuart Gordon l'ha adaptat alguna vegada.
there are these weird tentacled creatures coming from
Stuart Gordon
other
és un
worlds
director i
into
productor
ours,
de
and that they
terror
have been banished
bastant conegut,
and
per
that
qui
they
no ho
will
sàpiga.
return someday and regain what was once theirs.
The old ones are the universe, the old ones are the cosmos. They're that force beyond us that we're incapable of controlling, and they're that force,
La Caitlin no sé qui és, la veritat.
faster than we can ever comprehend.
Prior to Lovecraft, if you read horror, if you read ghost stories, you always have
Sí,
a
això és molt
vision
important el
of
que
a
està
world
dient.
which is fundamentally hospitable. God is
Aquí no.
looking after you.
Amb
God is
H.P.
looking after
Lovecraft
good people.
és un món que és
Good people will probably
superimmens,
survive
on hi ha una
horror
infinitat de
stories or
déus
ghost stories.
terrorífics que dominen i els humans són l'última merda.
He took it away from the ghost story, away from the gothic, and into this vision of a malign world.
A més, recordeu que amb tot això hi ha la Yamaha Cthulhu, que és un joc de rol que està ambientat en els universos de Lovecraft, potser un dels jocs més importants de la història de
But
rol.
what led an old-world xenophobic gentleman to write these
Xenòfob.
tales of unknown
Sí, hi ha molta
abominations
polèmica amb
and
això.
cosmic gods?
era bastant racista. També s'ha de ficar-nos en context per entendre l'època que vivia, l'entorn que vivia, però és com tot, no? Que si Hergé també era una mica racista, tots els autors d'altres èpoques, vulguem o no, eren tan racistes com l'època en què vivien. Mira, en 1890 és quan s'ambienten les aventures de Sherlock Holmes.
Lovecraft's family was very well-to-do, and I believe they considered themselves to be of the Providence aristocracy. The Phillips line goes back very far in Providence history.
Era molt senyorito, Lovecraft.
Late 17th century.
Massa senyorito.
The Lovecraft side originates in England. He could trace that all the way back to about the 15th century. There were Lovecrafts or Lovecrafts in Devon.
He was truly almost a Mayflower specimen, preserved in the formaldehyde of New England, you know. He was an Anglophile. He was a guy that definitely did not get laid much, you know, and a guy that was an alien amongst us, in the sense that he was not a very masculine
Home, no era gaire masculí perquè
After Winfield's death from syphilis on July 19th,
la seva mare el vestia de nena, aquí
young
esteu
Howard was
veient.
all Susie Lovecraft
Sí, la
had
seva mare el
left.
tractava com si
She
fos una
mothered her
nena.
child incessantly. So much so that she was known to make friends stoop when walking hand
I en
in hand
Lovecraft va
with her
quedar una
son,
mica...
for fear his arm would be pulled from its socket. Despite her over-attention, Susie Lovecraft's near-puritanical views restrained any physical affections toward her son. Lovecraft would later admit to his only wife that this form of mothering was devastating to him.
Pobre home, en part fa pena.
His grandfather, Whipple Phillips, was a very impressive industrialist. Lovecraft remembers Whipple telling him oral ghost stories at the age of 4 or 5. He tutored him in a number of other ways, tried to take an interest in his education.
In the attic was an immense library, presumably collected by his grandfather. And Lovecraft went up there as a boy with a candle secretly and started reading
Això
all
veiem que és
these
molt
old
habitual amb
books
tots els
and fell
autors
in love with the
reconeguts, que de
18th century.
petits descobreixen llibres d'algun gènere, s'aficionen a aquest gènere, s'acaben enamorant del gènere i anys després comencen a escriure sobre aquest gènere. Perquè si recordeu, Stephen King també va trobar una caixa amb llibres pulp i de més, de terror, i a partir d'allà, terror, ciència ficció, es va obsessionar amb el tema.
Those people. I want to be like Alexander Pope, who wrote poetry just for the love of it.
I've always had the subconscious feeling that everything since the 18th century is unreal or illusory, a sort of grotesque nightmare or caricature.
Lovecraft learned a lot in his
Tots els genis han tingut una vida de merda? Ha de ser així obligatòriament? Jo crec que sí,
His schooling was intermittent.
Mira, ho explicaré de manera fàcil. Jo crec que la gent que ha tingut una infantesa xunga fa que després, quan vegi que hi ha una cosa que se li dona bé, s'obsessioni amb això. Per exemple, els futbolistes, sempre es diu que els futbolistes que han passat gana de petits són els millors futbolistes quan són adults, perquè s'ho han tingut que treballar al triple per intentar arribar on són. I jo crec que influencia bastant, És més, si llegiu biografies, sobretot d'autors del segle passat, tots eren nanos malaltissos, que no sortien de casa, que es passaven el dia llegint i de més, i d'aquí que s'influenciessin, comencessin a escriure i tot això. Però sí, jo crec que el component tràgic, trist, solitari és molt important, sobretot amb autors.
Is a way of thinking about it, where you're working on a time scale where you talk about things like mountains are pushed up and erode, continents shift, species evolve and become extinct, but it's not really something you can process.
Humanity was limited to Earth, which made humanity itself small and threatened and fragile. So, because he was a threatened and fragile being himself, he populated that emptiness with monsters.
frequent visits to the attic gave Susie the impression that her son was trying to hide from the world and others, that he was a vulnerable child, uncomfortable with himself.
The relationship of Susie Lovecraft with her son was problematical at best. Clearly she loved him, but I think because of what had happened to her husband, Lovecraft's father, who had died of syphilis, I think she developed some weird love-hate relationship. Lovecraft called him hideous. He said to a neighbor that he had a hideous face, and that's why he wouldn't go outdoors much.
Susie repeated these opinions enough times that her son actually grew to believe them. Insecurity mixed with classical tendencies segregated young Lovecraft from others his age. But this solitary childhood only kindled his imagination.
I used to be tormented constantly with a peculiar type of recurrent nightmare in which a monstrous race of entities, called by me night gods, used to snatch me up by the stomach and carry me off through infinite leagues of black air over the towers of dead and horrible cities, with vast aggregations of night black misery, embodying monstrous perversions of geometrical laws.
Feeding his taste for the macabre
un dia li hem de dedicar un terrors nocturns a Pou, perquè també és un altre autor que m'encanta.
And you can see that heritage most clearly in those early stories that evoke effects such as those in the Telltale Heart, say. The Telltale Heart could have been written by Lovecraft.
Hombre, John Carpenter. Recordem que en La boca del miedo és... No. En La boca del miedo? No. Cony, com es diu? Ai, no me'n recordo, en Sam Neill de John Carpenter. És una obra adaptada a Josep Maria Poe. No, doncs el que deia això de John Carpenter a la pel·lícula que deia és una adaptació de l'univers del món de Lovecraft.
Epitomizes this trend, and actually I think if there's one positive thing to be brought out from that, other than he was a great writer, I think, any writer who feels down about their own work should read Lovecraft's comments about his own work.
He almost never has a good thing to say about his own work. This may be a kind of version of what he considered good manners.
H.P. Lovecraft no era un bon escriptor, no era un geni escrivint, narrativament no era un proverbi, potser ni estructuralment era un bon escriptor, però l'univers propi que va crear és molt important, o sigui, va ser bastant prolífic i va crear un món completament ben estructurat, ben format i de més, i va introduir termes o conceptes nous que és el que fa que la seva obra sigui tan important. Però la seva obra està plena de trucs d'escriptor barat. Sí, per exemple, l'adjectivació constant de bosque terrorífico o sigui, molts adjectius. O sigui, en lloc de crear-te l'atmosfera a través de la descripció, ell recorria molt els adjectius per intentar crear la sensació de terror. I després tenim el de personatges superplans, els diàlegs tampoc se li donaven gaire bé. Utilitzava truquets quan no sabia què fer, com era fer desmaiar el protagonista per la impressió.
Lovecraft's reclusion would last from 1908 until 1917.
1908 a 1917.
Judging from his letters, this breakdown had all the earmarks of a deep depression.
Depressió, fantàstic. Una curiositat, si li fiqueu barba a H.P. Lovecraft, és Mariano Rajoy. Gràcies per aquesta raid, Xendeluz. Moltíssimes gràcies. Estem aquí parlant del senyor H.P. Lovecraft, que estem mirant un documental, Guillermo del Toro, John Carpenter, molt bona, Chimère Fliu. Sé que us espantareu, alguns marxareu, però bueno, avui és nit dedicada a H.P. Lovecraft.
collar and looking
L'autor de
straight ahead,
terror.
not trying to make eye contact with anybody.
One activity that endured through this period was his reading.
Encara no has sopat. Vés a sopar, per favor. Vés a sopar, descansa i moltíssimes gràcies per la raït, Moltíssimes gràcies, segur que va bé el documental. No sé si a tothom li agradarà, però crec que el tema és interessant. Moltíssimes gràcies.
And then all of a sudden, here was this small world of amateur journalism where there were
Doncs això,
other people like
estem repassant la vida de Lovecraft.
trying to be writers,
Ara hem arribat
but
que
not
ja
writing for
comença a
money. And I
tenir...
think
Bueno, és
at
un
that
infant.
moment that was important to Lovecraft.
Pues sí, està penjat a
Because
YouTube, és molt
amateur
interessant
journalism
aquest
was a
documental,
kind of
en
school for
sèrio.
writers.
I els convidats que
Lovecraft went
tenen
on to publish
és
his own
genial. Bona
amateur
nit.
magazine, The Conservative. In its pages, he exhibited a strong passion for the beliefs he formed during his isolation, including a pronounced xenophobia.
Veus? La xenofòbia.
tendency observable in this age is a growing disregard for the established forces of law and order.
Sí, aquest és el gran problema de
Stimulated by the
Lovecraft.
noxious example of the almost subhuman Russian rabble, the less
Xusma
intelligent element
russa.
throughout the world seems animated by a singular viciousness.
Era un puto
Every
racista.
artist, every work of art is a product of his or her time. And he reflected a lot of very American feeling.
Sí, és molt complicat. És el que us he dit, clar. És fill de la seva època. Té el que té.
Reprehensible they were then as they are now, and yet in a sense you can't expect the guy to leap out of his skin and have modern sensibilities.
Era racista? Sí, però igual és racista que tothom a la seva època. No és que tothom fos super amistós i estigués super guai tot i ell fos un puto racista. No, és que tothom era igual racista. Només recordem que això, ell ve de família bona, és una mica elitista, una mica gilipolles ho era.
This absolutely genuine worry of the evils of breeding, mixed breeding. And breeding in general, I suppose. But the evils of taking purity with an almost Aryan sense of
Fill de l'època i esclau dels seus traumes.
The
Quina vida, sí,
Conservative
sí.
attracted fellow amateurs both sympathetic and contrary.
Ja sabem, amics, els
They were
autors de
attracted
terror,
by
tots
Lovecraft's
traumes...
erudite mind.
And as a result, Lovecraft developed very close ties to a number of these amateur journalists. And these became lifelong friends of his, and they exchanged many, many letters even after they had left the amateur
Bueno, això és impressionant. H.P. Lovecraft va escriure bastant, però el que més va escriure a la seva vida van ser cartes. S'escrivia amb moltíssima gent i han aparegut molts llibres recopilant les cartes, la correspondència d'H.P. Lovecraft.
And he developed followers. I mean, it's almost like a cult.
Ah, exacte, com un culte.
He wrote so many letters at such white heat and such intensity.
O sigui, era el WhatsApp de l'època, o sigui, per intercanviar una opinió amb algú que no vivia al costat de casa, tenies que tirar cartes. I el tio es passava el dia contestant cartes.
Over 120,000 letters written.
Què?
And these letters aren't short pieces, too. I mean, they're copious. Pages and pages of details and notes or suggestions on how to improve their own writing.
Clar, això ha fet que sabessin com pensava H.P. Lovecraft.
It also allowed Lovecraft to test early stories on respected readers. In 1919, an amateur journal called The Vagrant took notice. Dagon was the first of Lovecraft's stories to be
Dagon,
printed.
és un bon relat, Dagon, dels millors.
A captured sailor escapes German sea raiders, only to come aground on a stretch of sea bottom forced up by a volcanic upheaval.
The region was putrid with the carcasses of decaying fish and of other less describable things, which I saw protruding from the nasty mud of the unending plain.
It's got this awful sense of atmosphere. The poor guy.
Si heu llegit La pell freda veu moltíssim d'en Sánchez Piñol d'aquesta obra.
As the sailor explores the reef, he discovers a cyclopean
I
monolith
moltes obres
whose
posteriors
carved
veuen
surface
molt
depicts
d'aquesta
a
obra.
race of ancient fishmen.
They were damnably human in general outline, despite webbed
Tot el concepte aquest d'homes peix
shockingly wide and
veu
flabby lips, glassy,
de Lovecraft.
bulging eyes, and other features less pleasant to recall.
Suddenly, all hell breaks loose with this huge Charlie Tuna character coming out and embracing.
T'hi queda donar mal rotllo,
and then
un home
at the
peix.
end, what happens? Is the narrator just demented? He's now on the other side of the world, but afraid that old Charlie's following him. And he's, oh my God, the thing in the window. Well, has this creature followed him, or is he just plain nuts? We don't know, but either way, it's a great little story.
Pues començar ja amb aquest relat, ojo,
The creature from the cyclopean creature from the sea. It's virtually Cthulhu in miniature.
Dagon and other stories from this period would set the Lovecraftian model. Scholarly people discovering violations of
gente formada intelectualmente descubre violaciones y es conducida a la locura o a la muerte. Pues sí, és que sempre és això. És gent amb bona educació, gent culta, que arriba a un lloc i troba que allà passen coses molt xungues que escapen de la seva comprensió. Això fa que tinguin un atac. La forma de l'aigua sorgiria d'aquí, doncs, en veu molt. I ja veus que hi ha Guillermo del Toro. Sí. Si et fixes en quasi totes les pel·lícules de Guillermo del Toro, algun component de la mitologia de Lovecraft sempre hi és. Sí, per exemple, una obra que no tindria que estar lligada a Lovecraft, com és Blade 2, les boques aquestes que tenen els dolents i tal, aquesta subespècie de vampirs, té bastant de Lovecraft. I Hellboy té moltíssim de Lovecraft. El que passa és que Lovecraft mai ha sigut ben adaptat a la petita o gran pantalla, perquè és molt complicat.
It's not a modern style, it's not a stripped down style, it's not a very efficient style, and there are many things about it that are risible. He will pick a few words and overuse them.
Exacte. El vocabulari tampoc era molt... Veus el que us deia?
Nothing happens. Especially nothing happens to the narrator. They're just people who start terrified and they end up terrified.
And there are other things you can make fun of him for. The tendency to write in the first person.
Sí, també.
And to keep writing. The ultimate parodic Lovecraftian phrase is somebody going mad while writing and something's coming
Sí. Buah, per això... Sí, et va descrivint, o sigui, sempre acabava igual. Sí, és la història aquesta que us he comentat i al final sempre és això. El tio que està allà i estic sentint uns sorolls, sé que m'està seguint. Oh, què entra per la porta? No puc ni descriure, em falten les paraules.
And you know this guy went over it until he made the combination that to his taste, which may be gaudy to some, it was in perfect balance.
One thing that influenced this purple style was Lovecraft's current fascination with the writing of Lord Dunsany.
Dunsany wrote these magical little tales of dreamlands and
Veus, jo aquest no l'he llegit, aquest autor. Bueno, que sapigueu, estimats amics i amigues, que estic fent relectures d'Agatha Christie i Arthur Conan Doyle amb Sherlock Holmes, i que estic preparant cosetes, cosetes que us molaran molt. D'Agatha Christie ja tinc una cosa entre mans que us molarà moltíssim. I Sherlock Holmes estic intentant pensar si faig un especial Sherlock Holmes, un directe parlant-ne.
Though Lovecraft was now a published author, pursuing payment for what was only to be a personal pleasure was far from his idea of a gentleman, an existence that enjoyed being rather than doing. His fellow amateurs urged Lovecraft to go against his anti-commercialism and hire out his skills as a ghostwriter. As an invisible author, Lovecraft would be published many times between 1918 and 1920. With no practical experience in commerce, however, Lovecraft charged rates much lower than the standard of the time, barely clearing a minimum goal of $15 a week. Despite meager returns, this was a prolific time for Lovecraft. By 1921, he had written close to 17 stories.
A Espanya, dècada passada, va haver un tio que es va tornar boig i va adaptar les obres de Lovecraft amb una doble pel·lícula que era La herencia Valdemar i no sé què, que són pel·lícules independents, que no té ajuda de l'estat ni res, i que són molt, molt interessants. No dic que siguin bones, però que estan força bé.
A lone narrator emerges from his crumbling castle after a long seclusion. He comes onto the surface of the earth to find people fleeing in terror from a monstrous thing the narrator can plainly see before him.
I love the twist ending, so to speak.
And that you're reading the story and the very last line in the story scares you.
I was proud of this guy as he escaped from these catacombs. And the moment that the real people saw him and screamed and he saw his reflection.
And in horror stretches out his hand and touches a mirror. Boom! That's the end of the story.
Oh my gosh, he is a ghoul. He's a creature from the darkness. Now we must go off with him. And I went back and reread it just to see how he'd done that.
At his best, Lovecraft is as much as an existentialist as Albert Camus would be.
I know always that I am
Ho sento, però és que m'ha escrit un
a
missatge.
stranger in this century and among those who are still men.
This is
M'agradaria saber com era la veu real de
a
Lovecraft.
statement about how I felt in my teenage years as anything.
He's writing what may very possibly be disguised
Pues mira,
autobiography.
si podeu,
It does seem to be about somebody
és una bona manera d'introduir-te al món aquest de Lovecraft, la identitat de Valdemar.
But did he feel that
No dic que sigui una
because of
pel·lícula
that he was
perfecta,
an
ni molt
object
menys,
of horror, that everybody
però
shunned him?
Certainly, in terms of his
et fas una
physical
idea de com va
appearance, he was
tot.
sort of
I la
embarrassed
pel·lícula
about
aquesta
a
en
number
la...
of things. He felt he
És que
had,
no recordo com es
these
diu.
ingrown
En la
facial
boca del
hairs
miedo
that
crec que es
he
diu,
felt
però és
that
que no ho
was a
recordo.
disfiguring
D'en John
factor.
Carpenter, amb en Sam Neill de protagonista, és una altra gran manera d'introduir-te dins el món de Lovecraft.
I think he would come off much more as the weirdo that Colin Wilson makes him if he really were like these characters in the stories, and ultimately I don't think he was.
When Lovecraft emerged from his own isolation, the consensus of Providence was that the house on Angel Street was one to be avoided, and that Lovecraft and his mother were eccentrics. Though this view could be argued in the case of Lovecraft, Susie was indeed cause for concern. Her home life was one of hypertension, where Susie was known to cause major dramas over the slightest thing. On March 13, 1919, around the same time her son was emerging as a writer, Susie Lovecraft had been admitted to the same institution that claimed her husband years before.
Les institucions psiquiàtriques d'aquell moment...
1921, not from nerves, but from a botched gallbladder operation. Susie's death was hard on Lovecraft, both emotionally and financially. She left her son a meager estate, which was already meager when she inherited it from her father. That inheritance, plus an equally paltry income from ghostwriting, barely met Lovecraft's expenses.
He made little enough money himself and used to survive by eating hideous cans of beans.
But I have to wonder about Lovecraft and whether or not
És que m'estan sortint... Estic mirant missatges perquè estic organitzant la seva negra i tot el sant dia estic rebent comentaris o coses que s'han de tirar endavant.
That, you know, he was a gentleman, he is an author, and he's not going to just take any old job.
Lovecraft moved in with his aunts, Lillian Clark and Annie Gamwell. But aunts were
Com
no
veieu, el drama no
substitute for a
s'acaba
mother.
mai.
His fiction writing waned. Relief came from one of Lovecraft's fellow journalists.
Herbert West Reanimator actually is a very funny story, and Lovecraft intended it, I think, to be funny. It was commissioned for a humor magazine.
Què? Per una revista humorística?
Per installment.
Keep in mind, it was a humor magazine called Home Brew, founded and edited by one of his amateur friends, George Julian Houtain. Houtain said, you can't make them too horrible. So clearly, Lovecraft is encouraged to write just the most outlandish, flamboyant horror that he could think of.
Lovecraft chafed under the restrictions
És
of
un dels seus
episodic
millors
writing.
relats.
Still, the series debuted in January of 1922
Dr.
under
West
the banner
Reanimator, si no
Gruesome
recordo.
Tales, later to be titled Herbert West.
O Herbert West.
Of Herbert West, who was my friend in college and in afterlife.
És un relat molt pou.
Holding with Haeckel that all life is a chemical and physical process, and that the so-called soul is a myth.
té coses de Frankenstein, té coses de Poe.
I love the sense of atmosphere on the Herbert West stories, the sense of place that evidently were not in the movies, but that the sense of history, it gives you a sense of place and context that is extremely strong.
Now, a lot of people feel
mira,
the influence of
Frankenstein, és que sóc un puto geni,
I disagree because remember what Victor Frankenstein was doing was
jo no estic d'acord. Gràcies, senyor, per contradir-me en el meu canal de Twitch.
What Herbert West is trying to do is reanimate an entire living body after it has theoretically died.
Bueno, que sí, ja sabem.
West's adventures in reviving corpses was not among Lovecraft's favorite work, nor his most profitable.
El concepte de fons donar i té la vida és el
as a professional writer. During this time, Lovecraft also developed two fascinations incongruent with a xenophobic personality: travel and a woman.
Una dona.
Lovecraft had been lured away from Providence for a gathering of amateur journalists in Boston. The prospect of intellectual discourse
tinc ganes de tornar als Estats Units només per visitar Boston, Li tinc moltes ganes.
Rare trips soon became a habit, even if Lovecraft preferred to stay within the Northeast, where familiar traditions prevailed.
No sé per què em té enamorat Boston.
On one such visit, in 1921, H.P. Lovecraft met Sonia Haft-Green of New York. Born on March 16, 1883, Sonia was far more experienced in the ways of the world, having been married once before.
He met this woman who was Jewish.
One of the things that I found reading the letters, Lovecraft's letters, was how anti-Semitic he was. And the idea that he ended up marrying a Jewish woman.
Total, que odiava els jueus i s'enamora d'una jueva. Bravo, senyor Lovecraft.
He wasn't the worst catch in the world. I suppose he had a certain dignity. He was kind of tall and thin and bony.
She was just the opposite of him. You know, she was very outgoing and very social, and she sounded like she was fun. And, you know, she was the one who, as I understand it, introduced him to sex.
El sexe i Lovecraft. Un altre gran tema. Hi ha rumors que diuen que mai va perdre la virginitat.
Lovecraft and Sonia encountered a weird grunting noise in the night. It was an obvious inspiration for one of his stories, but Lovecraft encouraged Sonia to write it instead. This encouragement earned Lovecraft a kiss, his first since childhood, and that a rare sign of physical affection from his mother. Sonia's story became The Horror at Martin's Beach and was published in 1923. By that time, she had convinced Lovecraft to test the waters of New York City with a prolonged visit.
She knew that Lovecraft had to be taken out of Providence, that if he was going to really have a life, that he had to go out into the world, and she knew how talented he was, and she felt that if he went to New York, that, you know, where the magazines were actually published, and could meet some people, then he could become a success.
Pues vamos para allá.
But in a growing metropolis teeming with immigrants, an acute xenophobic like Lovecraft would soon experience problems.
És que m'imagino Lovecraft arribant allà, mare meva, que això està ple de negres, de xinos.
Sonia had entered his life. And in March 1923,
Weird Tales, capçalera imprescindible dins del gènere fantàstic. És el primer boom.
Weird Tales was very influential as it happened.
El boom d'aquest tipus de revistes és això, 20-30, i després cap als 40-50. Hi ha dues èpoques molt marcades.
Tales of the fantastic had been increasing in popularity.
Cap als 40-50 ja comença la ciència-ficció més pura. En canvi, els 20-30 eren això, fantasmes, monstres i tal. Hi ha el canvi aquest.
Toilet paper, it doesn't matter. There is a market there, and there are readers, and there was a place for it to start.
I per allà al mig, més cap als 40-50, hi ha l'aparició rematadora que va ser Richard Matheson, que ja sabeu sempre que us dic que és el punt d'inflexió de tot. Robert E. Howard, que és el creador de Conan. Ray Bradbury, Robert Bloch, l'escriptor de Psicosis. Ojo, aquesta quinta també d'autors, perquè Howard, el creador de Conan, també
It took a great deal of convincing from
obsessió amb
Sonia
la
and
mare,
other friends, but
poca relació amb les
Lovecraft finally
dones,
relented and sent in a selection of
es va acabar
stories.
suïcidant.
Weird Tales bought all 5 submissions. Thus began a lifelong relationship. On March 3rd, 1924, Lovecraft embarked on another relationship. After an aggressive campaign from Sonia, Lovecraft finally asked for her hand in marriage. The bride was nearly 41. The groom was 33.
His aunts were outraged by this. They thought that
Les
the
ties,
girl that he
sempre.
married was completely beneath him.
At huge risk to his sense of security, Lovecraft would leave Providence to live with his new wife in New York.
La cosa no
For a
surt bé.
virgin recluse of Puritan moral standards, marriage promised to be an interesting experience.
Sometimes I feel like she just must have been something just short of a saint.
Because what she married
Doncs sí.
was a guy who refused to work, really, except on his stories. This is the one area in which I think Lovecraft really failed as a human being.
And I think she acknowledged in her own memoir at some point that she felt like she could change him.
Bueno, això era una cosa bastant habitual.
She couldn't change
Us
him.
explico.
Between 1922 and
A finals del segle
1924,
passat, quan
Lovecraft's narrative
encara hi havia,
output was
com
on
dir-ho,
another
la gent de la
upswing.
noblesa,
This
la
included
gent
the
amb títols
creation of
nobiliaris
three
i tal,
recurring
amb el
elements
canvi de
of
segle
Lovecraft's
i les
gestating
guerres,
mythology.
tot això va canviar. Això un bon
Miskatonic
retratat que ho
University.
fa és en Agatha Christie.
The dark town of
De
Arkham,
la gent de bona família, cada
and
cop i volta,
literature's
canvien
most
les
dreaded
coses
grimoire,
i
written by an alter
ja
ego
no té el
from
nivell de
Lovecraft's
vida
childhood,
que tenia
one
abans.
inspired by his
I s'han de
reading of
començar a
the
espavilar.
Arabian Nights,
El que passa és que
the mad
treballar aquesta
Abdul
gent
al-Hazaret.
era impensable per ells. I molts van començar a recórrer a això, a la literatura que es considerava que era un art, que era una manera de viure bé. Val? I hi ha molts autors de famílies bones vingudes a menys que van començar a escriure. Molts poetes, narradors i de més. Oh, Necronomicon!
The Necronomicon was a book that collected all manner of summoning spells, spells that would cause the return of ancient creatures from unknown worlds
Bueno,
and
això no sé si ho
dimensions.
sabeu tota la història del Necronomicon, però quan ets adolescent i comences, o preadolescent i comences a llegir Lovecraft, és un d'aquells conceptes que et vola al cap. Sí, se suposa que és un llibre que ve d'Orient, que està folrat amb pell humana i que està ple d'això de encanteris, mitologia, que és un llibre prohibit que qui el llegeix acaba boig o mort. I clar, quan ets jove, ara ha canviat perquè hi ha internet, però jo, per exemple, de petit anava a la biblioteca i demanava: teniu el Necronomicon? Les rates en les paredes. Sí, és un altre.
All sorts of stories in it. Two from Lovecraft, Rats in the Walls and the Dunwich Horror. And he read them
L'horror de Dunwich, també.
Kid. It was mind-blowing.
A gentleman of the Delaporte family returns to his ancestral estate in England. There, he and his black-cat nigger man are disturbed by verminous slithering behind the walls.
Lovecraft was great at depicting the moment of discovery by sound or by a fleeting shadow, and it really put you there and made you almost
Això se li donava molt bé. Sí, crear una atmosfera, conceptes i de més, era un puto amo.
More than a lot of the stories, it literally embodies that sense of deep time, in the sense of as Delaporte is trying to investigate the source of the phenomenon in the house, begins to go through the sub-basement, the sub-sub-basement, down into these vast subterranean
Jogo, tu que deies que no coneixies Lovecraft, no sé si t'està molant i tens ganes de provar alguna cosa seu ara.
Is simultaneously an exploration into the depths of the past and the horrors that come out of history.
I seem to be looking down from an immense height upon a twilit grotto, knee-deep with filth, where a white-bearded demon swineherd drove about with his staff a flock of fungus, flabby beasts, whose appearance filled me with unutterable loathing. Then, as the swineherd paused and nodded over his task, a mighty swarm of rats rained down on the stinking abyss and fell to devouring beasts and man alike.
It's one of the stories where Lovecraft is playing with the classical Gothic tropes.
Lovecraft...
The family with the hidden things, you have all of these sort of...
Jo us explico la meva història. si no us agrada ho entenc.
All of this
Jo
strange stuff about the
sempre he
Exum
llegit.
Priory
El punt que vaig començar a llegir més i per compte pròpia va ser, no sé quina edat tenia, amb Sherlock Holmes. I molt aviat vaig començar a llegir ja de tot, però de tot. Ja us dic, de més menut ja llegia, però va ser amb Sherlock Holmes que em va implosionar el cap i vaig començar a llegir de tot. Ja tinc a punt l'herència de la mà de la televisió per quan acabi el directe. Genial, tio. Hi havia el pare d'un amic meu que quan el anava a visitar sempre ens parlava de Lovecraft i va ser ell qui em va començar a deixar llibres de Lovecraft, a explicar-me coses de Lovecraft i des de llavors de Lovecraft diria que ho he llegit quasi tot. Però també us dic que el meu preferit de Lovecraft és La sombra sobre Innsmouth, que m'encanta.
Work, however, and Lovecraft's drive to find it was limited.
I think he didn't want a job.
Que no quería trabajar.
And B,
no.
He knew that any employment he could find in the city of New York or elsewhere would be really bruising for him.
The longer Lovecraft stayed in New York, the worse his xenophobia became, almost as a retaliation against the immigrant outsiders flourishing around him.
The unraveling of the rug, so to speak, happened, because of financial reasons.
Jo en parlo entenc, Jo dic, faré projectes, faré coses xules i aconseguiré viure el que m'agrada, que serà que no. Però bueno, jo sí que he acabat acceptant feines que potser no eren el meu somni, segurament. Perquè, amic, s'ha de treballar.
Sonia had no choice but to leave for the Midwest, alone. Sonia would be back and forth to support her husband, but her influence over Lovecraft's mood was waning. His ridicule of the melting pot that was New York City reached manic, even racist levels.
No, a veure, Lovecraft majoritàriament va escriure relats. Ja tenim l'Adrián que apareix cada dia amb un nom nou.
For the most part, Lovecraft kept these views to himself, knowing full well that his friends and correspondents did not share his views. It wasn't long before his fiction gave voice to these demons.
Red Hook is a maze of hybrid squalor near the ancient waterfront, opposite Governor's Island.
Però això, sempre feia relats i em sembla que novel·les només té a les muntanyes de la Follia o a les muntanyes de la locura en castellà. Em sembla que és l'única novel·la. Tot l'altre són contes curts o contes llargs. La sombra sobre Innsmouth em sembla que és novel·leta curta, perquè no és gaire llarg.
Literary scholars, academics, and amateur psychologists.
For modern standards, there is plenty of racism in Mark Twain. There's plenty of racism in Edgar Rice Burroughs. There's plenty of sexism in Edgar Rice Burroughs. You could fault those works for belonging to that time, but I believe that it's actually a fossil record of what a gentleman of New England would think.
Sí, sí, sí.
It's very, very easy to look at Lovecraft and go, okay, well, Cthulhu means the female genitalia. Or all of these outsiders are really Jews or blacks, or this is what the Batrachian thing is all about. It's a cunningly disguised racism.
He did, however, make overtly racist statements towards some groups, and that's certainly no surprise back in the 20s and 30s.
És que què vols anar-li a dir, també?
I mean, that doesn't make it right, but I just don't think you can take it seriously.
Que una cosa que no hi ha cap cosa reconeguda de, jo què sé, que Picasso a un negre, o un xino, o a ningú. Però sí que la seva literatura i el seu pensament anava cap aquí, malauradament.
These streams of people who flooded the streets in Brooklyn, in Red Hook, Brooklyn.
And I think when he referred to himself as an unassimilated alien, I think he understood that when he was in New York, on some level he understood, despite all of his protestations, that New York worked. despite his perception of it as this horrid, chaotic cesspool, it was something
És una mica com
he
en
didn't work.
It became clear to
Travis
friends that Lovecraft's exile in New York was
com es diu?
leading to a
Joder, el
breakdown.
protagonista de
Some even feared a suicide attempt.
Taxi Driver,
Help came from
Travis
Lovecraft's
Bickle,
aunts, Lillian and Annie,
que
who found a small
això, que
home for their
veu la
nephew
ciutat i és,
back in the
joder,
safety
puta
of
merda,
Providence.
tot és
Sonia offered to
basura,
buy
la
the
gent que
house
hi ha
for
aquí.
him, but this was not New York. In Providence, propriety would reign. If Lovecraft could not support his wife, he would distance himself instead. In April of 1926, Lovecraft returned to his beloved city.
Tornem al poble.
He was released from Brooklyn, and he went back to his almost unimaginably immense relief in Providence.
That summer of 26 was the start of Lovecraft's richest period.
Caitlin sempre ha
It
sigut...
started with an idea he had outlined during
Caitlin,
those
ara m'he
fearful
perdut, no
days
sé
in
què
New
va.
York.
Ah, val,
An
val,
idea
ja
which
sé,
became
l'escriptora
the most
aquesta,
notable addition
No sé
to
qui és.
Lovecraft's fictional universe.
També dir-vos que hi ha una cosa molt curiosa, que suposo que deu ser aquest moviment. Va haver-hi un grup d'autors durant els 90, sí, finals dels 90, principis del 2000, que escrivien, autors que escrivien relats de terror i tot això, que van canviar-se de sexe, i hi ha tot un moviment. En Víctor Castillo, que avui no ha pogut venir, però és un tema que li interessa, en el seu llibre Pàgines desde el abismo, en treu un exemple. És que a finals dels 90, principis del 2000, els autors de terror americans és un món fascinant.
Prodigious claws on hind and forefeet, and long, narrow wings behind.
The description of the monster is probably better seen on paper than it would be visualized. That's the thing about Lovecraft. All his creatures are really interesting when you read them because your imagination starts to work on it, and you keep it amorphous and disgusting. With the seafood variety.
Sí, el símbol de Lovecraft, quan escrius amb emoticonos, sempre és el pop. Perquè molts dels seus monstres són això, tios, éssers amb
Angel's
tentacles i
investigations of the graven image are taken up by his grandnephew.
Here's this guy whose eccentric uncle died. He's looking through all these papers, as I did when Lynn Carter died. I mean, it's kind of a chore, but you never know what kind of goodies you're going to find, and he sees all these crazy things. What the heck was he into?
When you read it, it's sort of an incredibly clumsy story. It's here's a lump of this, and here's some newspaper reports, and here's
Mira, aquest estil...
It's sort of part journalism, and it's almost...
Aquest estil d'escriptura és el que va fer Stephen King amb Carrie.
It's assembled in fragments. In a very interesting way.
Si llegiu Carrie, és això, una barreja de notícies de diari personal, narració. Es barreja tot allà i és un poti-poti, però funciona.
It's about that recurring thing in Lovecraft, that fear of science or just human knowledge going where it doesn't need necessarily to go, of accidentally uncovering things that either, well, there's not much point in us knowing them, or knowing them could lead to our destruction.
The nephew endeavors to connect reports of vivid dreams across the world, dark practices in the bayous of New Orleans, and the discovery of a corpse city by a band of innocent sailors.
There lay great Cthulhu and his hordes, hidden in green slimy vaults, and sending out at last, after cycles incalculable, the thoughts that spread fear to the dreams.
Com veieu, la seva literatura, la seva narrativa és supercarregada.
All these deities, you know, or the King Arthur, waiting to come back, you know, and take over.
I hi ha això, sacrificis, tot pensat de cares a contentar els déus, que els déus suden de nosaltres com, vamos.
Destroyer. It's kind of another
Que
version of the
molt
devil.
d'això, si us fixeu, l'univers, el lore d'Alien, de Ridley Scott, també veu d'aquí en part. A veure, l'Alien d'Alien és bastant Lovecraft.
Of course, the discrepancy on the
Cthulhu.
pronunciation of the name. This is my fourth
Parlem del tema
language.
Cthulhu?
Poppy Z. Bright makes fun of the way I pronounce Cthulhu, but I don't know another way. You know, I look at the way Lovecraft tried to pronounce it, and I can't pronounce it.
many of his colleagues apparently didn't know how to pronounce it, or pronounce it wrongly.
És un dels déus, gran com una muntanya, amb ales, no sé què. I la gràcia que té és que Lovecraft diu que tots els noms que ell escriu de tots aquests monstres són impronunciables pels humans. Hombre, el d'Alan Moore. I Cthulhu, sempre hi ha la discussió entre tots els seguidors de Lovecraft de com es pronuncia realment. Cthulhu, Chulu. No hay modo de pronunciarlo bien. Exacte.
The Call of Cthulhu was initially rejected by Weird
Tales. La llamada Cthulhu és un dels contes més importants. No és dels millors per mi, però és dels més
presented with a story as original as Lovecraft's creation.
One of Lovecraft's tricks, of course, was to take the rejected story, sit on it for a little while, send it back to Wright saying, well, I've made the changes you asked for, having not done a single thing with it. And more often than not, apparently, Wright would fall for this trick.
The Call of Cthulhu was eventually printed in February 1928's issue of Weird Tales. Lovecraft's fee for such a seminal work of fiction?
$165. Recordem que va començar cobrant $5.
As Lovecraft's writing began to blossom, so did the man.
I vastly regret the absence of traditional accomplishments, fencing, horsemanship, military service, caused by my early ill health and lack of appreciation of the quality of well-roundedness.
Lovecraft began to entertain his friends once more, including them on long walks through Providence and other New England excursions. Lovecraft was even beginning to evolve a form of tolerance toward the outsiders around him, especially the many cultures now living in Providence. In February of 1927, it was time for his writing to expand as well.
Charles Dexter Ward is the novel in which he applies all his sense of structure to that long work, and the effect is tremendous.
Veus? El que hauria de fer, que mai ho he fet, és llegir-me l'obra de Lovecraft cronològicament, per veure això, perquè sí que ho he sentit moltes vegades. Que es veu una evolució, doncs clar, sempre els he llegit saltejats.
Especially by his continuing search for a certain grave dug in 1771, the grave of an ancestor named Joseph Curwen.
Joseph Curwen was an obscure individual who fled from Salem to Providence around 1761.
Començo a dir sureta, amics?
The thing about Joseph Curwen was that he did not seem to grow much older than he had been on his
arrival. És que avui he anat a fer una mica d'exercici, que feia dies que no sortia a fer exercici,
and without producing more than 5 years apparent change in his face and physique, the people began to whisper more darkly.
Alchemy and the black arts proved to be Curwen's secret.
I think one of the flaws of that story, and it may be only a flaw to me, is that it uses a kind of pseudoscience that is actually a little bit beneath Lovecraft's acumen. It explains the mysterious and horrifying events by reference to certain essential salts.
Utilitzava molts trucos. Però li perdones, és com si agafes Tintín, te'l llegeixes i veus que té una sèrie de trucs, de recursos.
And that's a little third rate. It's like bad science fiction.
Ostres, què passa quan des de temps?
And his unhallowed wizardry. That night was never remarked on again, until Charles Ward learned of his descent from Curwen.
Se't talla el vídeo? Hòstia, doncs avui la connexió va bé. Per ser divendres estaran superbé.
Summoning the unspeakable to life.
It's almost like a detective story, you know.
F5.
Is really discovering what happened to Charles Dexter Ward, you know, discovering about Curwen and the unfortunate accidents from the efforts to basically bring demons down from the stars. And when they didn't have all the pieces, when they didn't have all the remains, you know, terrible awfulness would be brung up and they'd had to be put somewhere. Of course,
per cert, hi ha ganes d'anar al cinema aquest cap de setmana. Jo intentaré anar a Muerte en el Nilo, que li tinc moltíssimes ganes.
His detractors say, well, he's writing about unspeakable horrors and simply telling us that they're unspeakable.
Que no sé què us va semblar l'anterior d'en Branagh, la d'Assassinato en el Orient Express, però a mi em va agradar bastant. I aquesta nova li tinc moltes ganes, Intentarem encolomar la criatura i així poder escapar-nos jo i la meva dona a mirar-la.
bodily form.
Tot i que aquest cap de setmana estic saturat de coses que he de veure. Que ja tenim Dune a HBO, Ara he de mirar quan la podré mirar tranquil·lament. I la nova La matança de Texas. I el documental amb Tarantino de Django. Tinc l'agenda ocupadíssima. I demà tinc examen, jo.
And he did press the envelope. Some of those last stories are really rather long, but they're also inert in a certain way that a novel cannot afford to be.
There was another tale written during this time on which Lovecraft held an entirely different opinion.
The Color Out of Space is just a great science
A mi la primera em va encantar. Tinc ganes de veure Mort al Nil. Les crítiques són disperses, Hi ha gent que li agrada molt i hi ha gent que no li agrada gens. Però bueno, jo la miraré perquè, com que la Cristi m'agrada, doncs... Esperaré a plataforma o en Blu-ray. Doncs tinc una bona notícia per tu. La tindràs molt aviat a Disney Plus. Perquè és a 20th Century, que forma part de Fox, que forma part de Star, que forma part de Disney. I recorda que les pel·lícules aquestes de Disney, al cap d'un mes d'haver-se estrenat, més o menys ja està a plataforma.
Was almost impossible to describe, and it was only by analogy that they called it color at all.
And the colour out of space, it is, as the story has it, just a colour out of space. It's literally indescribable in prose terms.
It's something that's almost impossible to even detect. It's something that's so incredibly insidious that there's no escaping from it, except by geographically removing yourself as far as you can from the place.
By the next harvest, flora and fauna are found deformed, and the Gardner family is infected with an unexplained madness.
Això és el color que caia del cielo, no? Mira, Jogo, dius, si aquesta funciona farà Déu negret, ja veuràs. Tinc els meus dubtes de si funciona, que de moment està funcionant prou bé, quina serà la següent adaptació. I no sé si serà Déu negrets o Morso del Sol, que jo crec que és molt probable que sigui Morso del Sol. Que també podria ser Mort a Mesopotàmia. Hi ha diversos de Porat que donen joc per ser pel·lícula. Déu negrets és molt interessant, però clar, no hi ha Porat. En canvi, Morso del Sol sí que hi és, Mort a Mesopotàmia també hi és.
Their lack of payment convinced Lovecraft that he should never stray
I també
far from the
m'agradaria que
known
en
quantity
Branagh
of
adaptés
weird
alguna història
tales.
de Miss Marple.
They would be the only magazine he formally submitted to for the rest of his life.
És que Weird Tales van passar-hi
During
tots,
a
tio.
1928 excursion to Massachusetts, Lovecraft happened on a ring of stones.
Ja està,
Oldest of
paranoia.
all are the great rings of rough-hewn stone columns on the hilltops, more generally attributed to the Indians than to the settlers.
Along with talk of witch blood, the eerie cries of the
A Mort al Nil tampoc hi ha Poirot, com que no? Però si és el protagonista. Què m'estàs dient, Jogo? Què m'estàs dient?
was born on the 2nd of February, 1913.
Lavinia Whately had no known husband, but according
A la
to the
versió
custom of the
teatral?
region, made no attempt to disavow the child.
En sèrio? Hòstia, això no ho sabia, doncs està malament, A la novel·la hi ha en Poirot, a l'adaptació del 78 hi ha en Poirot, a l'adaptació de David Sackett hi ha en Poirot, en aquesta hi ha en Poirot. Hi ha un capellà en lloc de Poirot, doncs molt malament. No devien tenir calés per adaptar-lo. Però sí, Mort al Nil és Poirot. És dels títols més importants de Poirot.
At the age of 10, Wilbur Whately attained an unnatural size, that of a fully grown man.
His facial aspect, too, was remarkable for its maturity. exceedingly ugly despite his appearance of brilliancy. There being something almost goatish or animalistic about his thick lips,
Ja està,
large,
racista.
broad, yellowish skin, coarse, crinkly hair, and oddly elongated ears.
What troubled the residents of Dunwich even more were the number of cattle purchased by old Whately without ever increasing the size of his stock, and the dreaded something being kept in the upper part of the Whately farmhouse.
There were twins that were born to Lavinia. And
hòstia, saps que conec una noia que es diu Lavinia?
mostly normal looking.
M'acaba de donar mal rotllo,
8 foot tall, goatish looking man. And a half seen, our invisible half brother, which is much more like his father.
Soon, a mysterious thunder was heard in the woods. Livestock and eventually entire families
Maldito
disappeared.
amarillo. Sí.
And Wilbur Whately was discovered breaking into Miskatonic Library in search of a complete
Oh, l'Universitat de Miskatonic. Mira, Necronomicon, Miskatonic. La Universitat de Miskatonic és la universitat mítica dins el món aquest d'H.P. Lovecraft.
Yog-Sothoth is the key and guardian of the gate. Past, present, future, all are one in Yog-Sothoth.
The Dunwich Horror earned Lovecraft his biggest payday from Weird Tales, $240.
$240.
Lovecraft failed to capitalize on his success and would not write for more than a year.
Sí, estem parlant de Lovecraft. De què va? Doncs és un documental sobre la seva vida. Jo crec que és dels millors documentals que s'ha fet sobre Lovecraft. Ja veuràs els convidats qui són. Guillermo del Toro, qui més ha sortit, John Carpenter.
On the surface appears to be imitations of other writers.
If you see the early stories, there is a much more constrained sense of scope.
Està bé perquè fem un repàs cronològic a tota la seva obra literària. El que em sorprèn és que han tractat poc les seves adaptacions. Aquest és el Carpenter de Iaio, no? Bueno, de Iaio. Sí. Però aquest documental ja té mínim 15-20 anys, El documental és bellot. No sé si has vist últimament en Carpenter, però està bastant més carregat. Bueno, això que veieu aquí en Guillermo del Toro amb aquest monstre típicament de Lovecraft és casa seu. No sé si sabeu la història aquesta de Guillermo del Toro, que fa al·ludir profundament. El fill de puta de Guillermo del Toro té una casa molt xula, però davant de casa seu allà on els americans tenen la casa de convidats. Ell té una petita mansió victoriana, de l'estil victorià, que és una casa museu. I quan dic casa museu és que té cada planta i cada sala és temàtica. I té una sala dedicada a Lovecraft, una sala dedicada, jo què sé, als monstres de la Universal, una sala dedicada a pròtesis que han utilitzat en pel·lícules de terror i ciència-ficció. El fill de puta té una casa museu només per ell, allà al seu jardí, i que de tant en tant fan visites.
A place Lovecraft had always longed to visit, but never did. Later, she moved to California, where she remarried and led a full life until 1972. In 1930, Lovecraft had begun work on a new tale.
Quin conte és?
By the time it was published in August of 1931, the changes in Lovecraft could be glimpsed on the page.
Well, we need to celebrate the Whisperer in Darkness because, of course, the astronomers have now taken the planetary status away from Pluto.
Ah, no, doncs no és tan bé el documental, perquè està parlant d'això. El que era Guillermo del Toro sembla un Iñaki o alguna cosa per l'estil. A mi em sona alguna pel·lícula, però no sé què
After a
és.
rash of unprecedented floods in Vermont, misshapen cadavers wash up along the riverbanks.
They were pinkish things, about 5 feet long, with crustaceous bodies bearing vast pairs of dorsal fins or membranous wings, and several sets of articulated
Els
limbs.
marçons de Lovecraft devien ser
Albert
bastant
N. Wilmot
xungos.
of Miskatonic University begins to investigate the origins of these alien things.
The blasphemies that appeared on the Earth came from the dark planet Yuggoth. But this was itself merely the populous outpost of a frightful interstellar race whose ultimate source must lie far outside even the Einsteinian space-time continuum.
It's actually one of Lovecraft's most restrained stories. There are very few of those runs of adjectives. Most of it is done as a series of letters, something I imagine he probably learned to some extent from the novel Dracula, which he greatly admired.
Through the first-hand contact of his colleague Henry Akeley, Wilmarth learns of the dark intentions behind the buzzing creatures. What Akeley deems a deadly danger, however, turns out to be something else entirely.
In the last stage of Lovecraft's career, when he began to write the best stories, in spite of their being what I called inert earlier, you can see him taking a different angle of vision on the monsters at the heart of what is known as the mythos. The Whisperer in Darkness is probably the first story in which one begins to see this shift in attitude. They're still frightening, and when their voices are recorded on tape, they are intensely scary beings, but they may not be completely inimical to the human race.
In fact, the fungi from Yuggoth wish to expand man's senses.
L'últim relat que vaig llegir a Lovecraft és Shadow of the Time. Està molt guapo, molt a la seva línia. Hosti, jo ara fa temps que no llegeixo Lovecraft. L'últim va ser una altra vegada la Sombra sobre Innsmouth, que va ser l'any passat, crec. A mi el que passa és que Lovecraft m'agrada molt, però em carrega. Ara, per exemple, m'he llegit dues novel·les de l'Agatha Christie i ja la segona era com... També m'agrada molt l'Agatha Christie, però reconec que com que és tan... com a gran descripció, fa que no em pugui llegir dos de seguits, bueno, tres de seguits, dos he pogut, tres ja se'n faria llarg. Sí, Positrònic, a mi és el meu preferit. La Sombra sobre Innsmouth és el que més connecto. El millor de la Sombra sobre Innsmouth és que jo abans d'aquest vaig llegir, sabeu aquells bolsilibros que s'intercanviaven i tot això? Doncs un d'aquests bolsilibros imitava completament la Sombra sobre Innsmouth i me'l vaig llegir. En el seu moment estava a vacances a una casa familiar que tenia i quan vaig llegir la Sombra sobre Innsmouth dic, però si és una copiada, i s'havien copiat.
It is altogether against my will that I tell my reasons for opposing this contemplated invasion of the Antarctic, with its vast fossil hunt and its wholesale boring and melting of the ancient ice cap.
Què us recorda això?
The exploring world in general.
La Cosa John Carpenter veu moltíssim de Lovecraft també, tot i que està basat en un relat d'un altre autor. Sí, és que Positrònic, el que dius, Lovecraft és molt estrany perquè mai ha sigut ben adaptat, però ha influenciat a tantes coses. Sí, doncs això, o sigui, la cosa està basada en un relat del director de Weird Tales, si no recordo malament. Està basat en aquest relat, però és que aquest relat veu absolutament... O sigui, el relat veu de Lovecraft, però l'adaptació de Carpenter veu molt del relat, és bastant fidel, però alhora veu molt de Lovecraft. Positrònic, ja que a tu t'agrada, tu quina creus que és l'adaptació o no adaptació que hagi adaptat millor Lovecraft al cine? Jo deia En la boca del miedo, però La cosa potser també s'hi acosta molt. Aquesta, Les muntanyes de la follia,
The
Ho
survivors
dic
of
així
the
perquè
unfortunate
aquest era el títol
expedition
que va tenir en
discover a
català,
cyclopean city hidden among
adaptat
the peaks.
per l'editorial Aertes.
They learn the tragic history of the
És la gran adaptació que sempre ha volgut fer Guillermo del Toro, que tenia planejat fer-la amb Tom Cruise.
Of cosmic infinity and falling prey to their slave race of shogots, protoplasmic masses capable of molding their tissues into all sorts of forms.
You know, in the 60s there was the idea that aliens had come here and had kind of created the human race, but that idea really was old compared to what Lovecraft had dreamed up, which was the idea of these battling alien forces, you know, on Earth, and that man ended up somehow inheriting this thing almost by default because these two major presences had sort of wiped each other out.
The old ones in Anthems of Madness are scientists. They were artists. They were architects. Yes, they are tentacled cucumbers with wings, but they are sentient, intelligent beings. And that sense of intelligence makes the evil at work in
Positònic diu, tampoc he vist tantes adaptacions a Lovecraft pròpiament dites, almenys no tan evidents. Normalment és més un rotllo d'acabar a inventar el concepte en general del terror còsmic, i a partir d'aquí es va obrir aquest camí. Tenim les adaptacions espanyoles com Dagon i de més, les adaptacions que també van fer Stuart Gordon i de més, però sí, les adaptacions literals d'obres concretes no acaben de funcionar del tot normalment. És més això, els conceptes com l'exploten en altres pel·lícules i a més. Però tota la mitologia alien veu de Lovecraft. Fins i tot això que estàvem comentant ara, de que els races superiors, experiments científics, que la humanitat i de més, que surt la chihuahua de la que se avecina. Sí, la Macarena. Que per cert, la Macarena viu aquí al costat de casa meva. No al costat, sinó al poble aquí al costat de casa meva.
Essentially lands on a planet and they find a derelict city-sized ship, dead denizens in it, and something that is very much alive and waiting, and then takes over the humans. That's essentially, you could say, very much at the mantle of madness. It has influenced the story that the thing.
Mira, veus la cosa.
Which was a direct rip-off of At the Mantle of Madness. So I think its repercussions are very cinematic.
This was the crowning jewel of the Cthulhu mythos.
It clearly came as a crushing blow when Farnsworth Wright, editor of Weird Tales, rejected it.
Espera, aquí en Guillermo del Toro es flipa una mica, diu que és una obra molt cinematogràfica. Jo diria que just al contrari. Perquè és no sé quantes pàgines que no passa absolutament res. Hi ha gent caminant.
Most, like the shadow over Innsmouth, were problematic for Lovecraft.
Lovecraft himself seemed almost embarrassed by
tot i que a les muntanyes de la Follia està ben escrit, però és que és això, et passes la meitat de l'obra que no passa res.
And why is everybody so down on Innsmouth?
Aquesta, Innsmouth.
About old Captain Marsh driving bargains with the devil and bringing imps out of hell to live in Innsmouth. Some of them have queer, narrow heads with flat noses and bulgy, starry eyes that never seem to shut. And their skin
això d'Innsmouth és aquest tipus d'il·lustracions. O sigui, és millor imaginar-t'ho tu i ho faràs més real que quan vegis aquestes il·lustracions.
It's definitely a sort of biological horror story where you have the breakdown of not just human society, but of the human body. But I think the overriding concern is actually about culture. You have the culture of the Deep Ones coming up and over the decades eating away the culture of Innsmouth, so that finally Innsmouth will vanish
There is, to be sure, a kind of racist or xenophobic undercurrent.
Bueno, Casademont, Innsmouth no és xenofòbia, exactament. O sigui...
indirectly expressed. I'm now beginning to think it must be one of Lovecraft's one or two best stories.
És que és de les millors, ja ho he dit jo.
That you don't see a whole lot of Lovecraft doing in writing action scenes. You know, I still think that the escape from the Gilman Hotel is a marvelous action scene.
És que és de les escenes que més se queden gravades al cap.
Frogfish things. It's wonderful and not the sort of thing that he did a lot.
Lovecraft never formally submitted The Shadow over Innsmouth for publication.
Hòstia, no sabia que no s'havia publicat.
Partially, Lovecraft marginalized himself because he was never very complimentary of his own work. But I think readers and critics neglected to see the imagination.
És que no deixa de ser un relat de monstres, però ho relata de tal manera que és supertens. Jo crec que és la més realista de les seves històries, també perquè és la que tenim més a prop cronològicament. Però és que és una història fins a cert punt típica, però amb el component aquest que et va desvetllant a poc que la gent d'allà no és gaire normal. Home, $595 era una pasta ja en aquella època.
Lovecraft's health began to diminish.
In many ways, I think if Lovecraft had preserved his health, he would have become a well-known writer in the 40s and 50s if he had lived that long. I think Lovecraft really died at the pinnacle of his talent.
Lovecraft had been suffering from a small collection of ailments, including digestive trouble.
Però en el sentit d'una fòbia literal.
To a doctor's diagnosis,
the
cancer had spread through his small intestine.
La seva obra en general té tocs de xenofòbia, però a veure, Innsmouth...
He was 46 and a half years old.
No és que tingui xenofòbia, és que realment el que està visquent...
Although he knew himself celebrated in a small circle,
aquella gent molt normal no és. Jamás llegó al público masivo. I ara, en canvi, tothom qui li agrada la ciència-ficció o el terror, tothom coneix Lovecraft. I aquí ve això. Això és molt curiós perquè Lovecraft mor, però hi ha un seguit d'autors amb qui s'escrivia correspondència i de més que van tirar endavant això, el cercle Lovecraft, que eren escriptors amics seus que van seguir utilitzant tota la seva mitologia per anar seguint fent històries.
And released a collection of stories entitled The Outsider and Others by H.P. Lovecraft.
Well, Arkham House came into being virtually out of Lovecraft's death. I mean, almost immediately on the news of Lovecraft's death reaching August.
Clar, però està basat en la por que inspiraven els pobles rurals, que eren gent endogàmica, aïllada i amb creences estranyes, a vegades. Juga molt amb aquestes fòbies sorgides de l'ignorància i la por al desconegut. No et dic que no, tot i que ell preferia viure al poble que no preferia viure a la ciutat, o sigui que... Entenc el que vols dir, però jo crec que, a veure... I fins a cert punt... Sí que hi ha relats que realment diu coses lletges dels negres.
Specializing in mainly supernatural horror, a very small smattering of science fiction.
It was a cheap, disposable literature. And Arkham House was one of the very first places to actually say some of this stuff needs to come out respectably.
Since the success of Arkham House, many writers have continued to expand the Cthulhu mythos. In fact, this was a practice Lovecraft encouraged when he was alive.
Però després ambienta totes les seves històries en poblets i sempre passen coses rares i gent rara en poblets. Sí, jo crec que escrivia sobre pobles perquè coneixia més els pobles, perquè això, quan va viure a Nova York tampoc ho va passar gaire bé.
And August Derleth, they took a little of this, took the story, added to it, passed it on. And so then we started doing it.
The problem when I was a teenager was, I read Lovecraft and I thought, this is how you do it. But unfortunately, what I meant by this to myself was, this is how you imitate it. And worse still, although I've never been more than 20 miles away from Liverpool in England, I set these stories in Massachusetts, in Arkham and places like that, Kingsport. And it was painfully obvious that I'd never been very far from Liverpool, particularly when the rustics opened their mouths.
If you read a story like Mist, King's novella, that's pure Lovecraft. It's about these tentacle things breaking through from some other dimension and terrorizing a grocery store in Guessware, Maine. That's pure
la niebla és absolutament
I did a story called Shoggoth So Peculiar, in which I have two Lovecraftian beasties complaining about Lovecraft as a writer. But the truth is that we only parody things that have life. There is no point in parodying something dead. There is no point in parodying something
Sí, la novel·la, que no és ben bé una novel·la per si sola, em sembla que està dins un dels seus recopilatoris de novel·letes. Estava bé el relat.
Lovecraft still matters.
And it is a passion that continues to this day, even in the face of criticism.
Well, there's always going to be a kind of snobbery about supernatural horror fiction, I think. The writer needs to be dead for maybe 100 years before he's fully taken seriously.
Bueno, és que això són les grans revolucions de Stephen King, que és el primer autor de terror que ha tingut reconeixement ja en vida. Passen molt poques vegades. Normalment els autors de terror poden tenir molt èxit comercial però no ser reconeguts críticament, i per això Stephen King, tot i que una mica tard, però ha tingut reconeixement crític abans de morir.
It's very easy for us now to forget in a world in which, as a fantasy, horror, science fiction, whatever the hell I am, author, my books are going to come out in hardback.
La niebla és l'única adaptació de la qual al final supera el llibre. Dit pel propi autor, sí, és que al final és... Home, és que amb lo prolífic que és aquest home, si encara escriu com el primer dia, o millor, a la seva edat. Sí. Stephen King no crec que escrigui millor ara que abans, però sí que m'ha agradat la conversió aquesta que ha fet de passar del terror pur a començar a tirar cap a la novel·la negra. M'ha agradat molt. Mira, Hellboy, La Cosa, Doctor West. Stephen King, després de veure el final de la pel·li, va dir: per què collons no se m'ha acudit a mi? Pirates del Caribe, també?
You look around these days and you get the plush Cthulhu phenomenon. You get Cthulhu slippers. You get funny
això de Cthulhu ara s'ha rebaixat una mica, però fa uns anys Cthulhu estava tot arreu.
And they knew all of the Lovecraft creatures, but they had never ever read Lovecraft. They didn't know what the stories were.
His images are so outre and ghastly and macabre and colorful that they influence all kinds of rock and roll bands.
I think he also literally appeals to the outsider and the person who is not well accepted in society.
Mira, tio, ho està clavant John Carpenter. Sí, hi ha molta gent, per això és literatura que l'has de començar a llegir d'adolescent. Jo crec que Lovecraft, si el comences a llegir molt gran, ja. Jo és que m'ha estadejat una partida de rol amb amics de Call of Cthulhu i m'he tingut que empullar bastant tot el seu lore. És que... Veus, jo mai he jugat a la llamada Cthulhu. I hauré de jugar algun dia,
that some occultists insist that Cthulhu mythos is no myth.
I know every religion begins as the delusion of one or two people.
Però la llamada Cthulhu, jo havia tingut les cartes, el joc de cartes, i a mi és que em fascinava els conceptes.
When you're one of the very few who believe it, there's a kind of an intensity that results in an unbalanced character. That's what I'm afraid of with cultists that actually believe there are old ones.
I think that every time somebody comes out with a world as fully fleshed out as Lovecraft creates, you are bound to find people that will start speaking Klingon or dressing like a hobbit to go to the supermarket or believe that they can actually channel in a couple of old ones into their living room. You know, and I believe that some people have actually even died trying to invoke some of the ancient gods.
I knew people that handled Star Wars this way. They were so absorbed in it. One of them wished it were true, you could tell, and another
amics,
believed it
no
was
són
all true
bojos.
in a parallel world. And, you're beginning to go off the deep end.
Una llàstima que aquest home no llegís l'adaptació del Hobbit al final. Guillermo del Toro, vull dir. Jo és que a mi no m'agrada Guillermo del Toro gens. Com a director no m'agrada gens. I Peter Jackson tampoc m'agrada com a director, o sigui que... Mira que el Senyor dels Anells em va agradar, Està bé. Tot i que som més del Hobbit. Però a mi és que Peter Jackson no m'agrada com a director. I Guillermo del Toro encara menys.
And while certainly there have been far too many people, not least me, imitating him too closely, he also has had a profound influence.
I el Hobbit també el tenia que dirigir en Sam Raimi en un principi.
Poppy Z. Bright, Caitlin Kiernan, Ted Klein, you name it.
For me, what is the brilliance of Lovecraft, what's so important about Lovecraft is simply his imagination.
It's incredible to think that this guy who was this recluse living in this, little house in Providence, Rhode Island, ends up spawning, essentially modern day.
No, el tio estava...
It's the duality of Lovecraft. It's the fact that people can take the ideas almost as the basis of a religion. People can take the ideas from a serious academic point of view.
Ho estic dormint molt fort,
And then you can...
Ja s'acaba, per cert, el documental.
Then if you just like drawing great big monsters, Lovecraft is waiting for you too.
S'acabó, mira, l'he clavat. Francis Campbell, John Carpenter, Guillermo del Toro, Neil Gaiman, Stuart Gordon, Jacint, no sé qui és, la Caitlin... Bueno, és que els noms són Peter Straub, és que, clar, és... El documental està molt bé, molt. Llàstima això que les adaptacions cinematogràfiques no se'n parla gaire, però en general el documental m'ha agradat. Bé, fins aquí el directe d'avui, no afegiré gaire cosa més. Espero que us hagi agradat. Igualment he parlat amb en Víctor Castillo i sí que farem alguna cosa a Lovecraft, algun directe al Terrors Nocturns, parlant de la seva figura. Ell sobretot domina el rol i les adaptacions cinematogràfiques, els relats també se'ls ha llegit, però sí que li hem de dedicar. Queda pendent fer Poe, Edgar Allan Poe, que crec que pot ser bastant interessant. El Yoshi és la mascota del Mario. Anava a dir una cosa així, però m'he callat. Però sí, com sigui, que res, que ja li tocava a Lovecraft passar-se per Terrors Nocturns i que en parléssim una mica. Ja està, és tot. Recordeu a marcar el cor, l'estrelleta. Si teniu Amazon Prime us podeu subscriure al meu canal. I és tot. Moltíssimes gràcies per ser aquí. Ens veiem ben aviat. Suposo que dilluns toca Enigmes Pendents, que ja sabeu de què va. D'acord? Doncs res, molt bona nit i moltes gràcies per passar-vos per aquí. D'acord? Fins la propera. Bona nit.